welcome. I am Dr. Lauren, and welcome back to Think Dyslexia Network. So today's guest is Dean, and you are the founder of NoticeAbility, right?
I'm the founder and the executive dyslexic of NoticeAbility.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, yes.
And so today I really want to delve into your story. Yeah, because I know you're dyslexic as well. I saw your TED Talk. I was moved by it. And I also want to hear more about NoticeAbility and what services you have and what you can bring to the audience so they get a better understanding. So obviously this is a general question and you could take it anywhere you'd like, but what is your dyslexia story? When were you diagnosed? How has that been for you in terms of navigating through the world?
Uh, sure, and thank you for having me, first of all. But and if any of this is redundant, because it was said in my TED Talk, I apologize in advance. But I think that what I like to do is I like to highlight the advantages I was given, meaning the privilege that I was given, because ultimately we will speak about how the fact that I was given these privileges and still my story didn't turn out to be rosy and wonderful underscores the fact that in the field of dyslexia, I think we're neglecting to focus on certain aspects of the dyslexic journey. So that's sort of a preface to what I will say. In terms of those privileges, as a 1973 baby, I was diagnosed extremely early. I was in fourth grade when I finally got my diagnosis, and fourth grade is almost fairly average for this day and age, if a child is even lucky enough to get a diagnosis.
Right.
So, that timetable was very, very progressive. And as a result of that, my mother, who is a child developmental psychologist, was able to, she was doing her dissertation at Columbia. She sort of access, what we would now prescribe routinely as OG intervention, right? Or structured literacy as a form of intervention. Ironically, my father, who was, and I say past tense because he's deceased, was a journalist and author, discovered he was dyslexic as a result of my diagnosis.
Of course, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, that happens frequently, So this is a, St. Paul's, Yale educated guy who was in the literary field and had no idea he was dyslexic until he was in his mid 30s. Having access to that intervention and having sufficient resources to afford the access to that intervention allowed me to become what I would say a competent reader, not a confident reader, but a competent reader. And, I'm still to this day not somebody who likes to curl up with a book around the fire. That's not my definition of fun. It never will be. But I was able to at least sort of slay that dragon to a degree. But what it didn't do was it didn't address the fact that I was going to still have to work twice as hard or three times as hard as my peers in order to succeed academically. And I took, I think, unfortunately, it's the path less frequently chosen by dyslexics because they have all these compounding external influences that force them down the road of surrender. Right. I was able to see that path, and then at the very last moment choose to sort of form the chip on my shoulder and say, I'm going to prove everybody wrong, and I'm going to just buckle down, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to get the grades that everybody believes, again, at that point, believes that I'm smart. Right. Because at that point, I didn't believe I was smart. And my high school journey was hard fought in terms of early education, the bullying, both by peers and teachers in some cases, but then eventually finding some academic success in high school, and just grinding it out. But ultimately getting admitted into a very competitive private college in the state of Maine called Bates. And that was a huge validation moment for me, because I knew that there wasn't Bates didn't have any quota for dyslexic kids. They didn't have any obligation to take me. They took me because they wanted me. They thought I would be an appropriate student for their learning environment. And that was the first glimmer of what I would say was sort of genuine sort of building block of self-esteem. Until that point, and this goes back to what I said in the beginning, until that point, I truly believed that I was stupid, even in lieu of being able to achieve good grades. And that validation from Bates convinced me that perhaps I should revisit this assumption that I was stupid. But Lauren, what I will say is that I harbored and continued to harbor, and even to a degree continue to this day to harbor a question of my self-worth, a question of whether or not I do deserve a seat at the table. It's almost like dealing with that imposter syndrome.
Yes, yes.
And that malignant self-esteem, in many ways went unremediated. And so when you are an adolescent emerging into high school and college, and your peer group around you starts to engage in drugs and alcohol, and you desperately want to self-medicate that deficient self-esteem, you start to use these external assets in order to address that deficiency inside yourself. That may be drugs and alcohol in one case, that may be dropping out of school in another case, that may be joining a gang in another case, but trying to struggle to find identity.
Right, to find where you belong, to find what feels good, right?
Exactly. And just to find, it's a brilliant guy in Florida, who I'll quote, says that it's scary. It's terrifying to be lost. It's another level of terrifying to realize that nobody's looking for you. And
that's deep.
Right. And as a good dyslexic, I'm forgetting his name right now. I wish I could attribute it to him directly. But the idea is that while I had people that were looking for me, I realized that many people with dyslexia don't even have people looking for them in the educational system. And, one of the things that I said early on was that I like to highlight my privilege in order to say that if I got all of these things, and you'll often hear it in the dyslexia field, early detection, reading remediation, and academic support will get a student to success. And I contest that assumption, because without a social emotional development that leads to a genuine sense of self, purpose, and confidence, you've just got a competent reader with low self-esteem. That doesn't really amount to an empowered human being.
Right.
So I'll pause on my story because it goes on.
Well, and I definitely, as I was listening to you, there were so many things that I want to touch on. So first things first, I appreciate you discussing your privilege, because that makes a lot of sense. You said your mother was a clinical psychologist?
Child developmental psychologist. Yeah, but clinical. Yeah.
Right. So, that is like, she already knew more than the average person, especially around this time period in the early 80s. So you got that intervention, you got that diagnosis. I started my career in a private dyslexic school, and I didn't know anything about dyslexia. And I went to Syracuse University, great special ed program for my master's degree, but I don't ever remember anyone talking about dyslexia. And so when I landed this job, I remember the head of school was like, "You're going to work with a Norton Gillingham fellow. You're going to get the gold star standard." I didn't really know what any of this stuff was. I had no idea that this would be what I'm focusing on now. And I look at the kids, and I taught fourth grade. So when you said fourth grade, I thought about my students. And most of these kids came from public school, and their self-esteem was totally just, they didn't feel like they could amount to much. And after, 6 months or a full year at this school, it's their self-esteem skyrocketed. And it was because of the early intervention, because of the teachers that understood how their brain worked, the processing time, the social emotional aspect. It was just amazing to see that. However, in public school, when kids are not identified, and I've worked at the secondary level, you see these kids, especially the kids who don't have the privilege or the money or even understand what dyslexia is. But it's just, that came to mind. And the other thing that you had mentioned too was you didn't feel you were smart until, you know, you had that validation of getting into Bates. And I have to say, and I've mentioned this in other interviews I've done, so I am not an adult with dyslexia. I am neurodiverse, and I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 21. And so for my entire schooling, I thought I was stupid too. You know, I was just like, oh, well, I can just talk to anyone. And a lot of my way of showing my um, mastery was talking, you know, was really working through it. And even still to this day, I need to process things. I have to talk about it. And so because a lot of the ways that teachers teach are very traditional, sit in your seat, you know, write notes and take notes and look at the board and write papers and all of those kinds of things, I was like a BC student, and it was really hard for me to get A's because I had the worst testing anxiety. Yeah. So it was the kind of thing when I had that diagnosis, it was like, and I don't actually know, but you were in fourth grade. It's probably similar to adults that get diagnosed with dyslexia or ADHD, where you're kind of, you go through this like feeling of, wow, that's what was wrong. And then you're like, wow, well, how come I didn't know this sooner? And, you know, all these things. And so that's kind of how I felt. But now as an adult, like now having a family and, you know, teaching and running, you know, I think dyslexia, I'm like, no, but my difference is unique. And I think that's why I'm able to always connect with all of my students, especially my special education students. So those are some things I thought about when I heard your story, and I'm like, you know, we're all connected in some sort of way.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to there. One of the things that I think is particularly frustrating is that one can argue the social construct of learning disabilities, right? It's like, I don't have a disability unless you force me to do all of my learning through the written word and reading. Right. If you give me content through different modalities, I have no learning disability to speak of, right? And I'm using the word disability specifically as opposed to difference, which I use in my common vernacular. But the point is that it's a social construct, it's a disability in the social construct. And that's what frustrates me, is that it's institutionally, it's being reinforced, and it's degrading the lives of millions of students because we haven't adapted and adjusted to contemporary forms of information digestion that we have the choice as adults. I've got a supercomputer here, right, where if I want to watch what's happening with a hurricane, I can listen or watch a video. I don't have to read it. So right. Why is it that a student is forced to consume all of their content through this one specific and limited modality? Same with an ADHD person, right? I mean, there's myriad modalities that you can choose from to get that content in a way that feels organic. Right. So it's, you know, the one other thing that I will say, and I have a feeling that you and I are going to have an interview that goes about 18 hours right now, but just because I see a lot of stuff we need to talk about. But the other thing I thought you were about to say, and I'll try to be less long-winded about this, was I thought you were going to say, you were going to allude to the almost predictable and inherent guilt that a lot of parents feel, or teachers who aren't exposed to what dyslexia is when they're taking their graduate work. And that guilt, I want to address straight on by saying I understand it, I empathize with it, but if you're watching a video like this, it is totally inappropriate. You can put that guilt aside because you didn't deliberately keep yourself in ignorance. You didn't know about it. That's not your fault. Now you do, and now you're watching Dr. Lauren, right? about it. So that guilt should be put aside.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's, I actually did a presentation on the relationships with teachers and families of children with dyslexia, because it's just, there is a lot of guilt. And as you said, your father didn't know until you were diagnosed. And there's a lot of that there. I mean, I saw that firsthand when I was in private school. It was like parent teacher conference, and the dad or the mom is like, oh, wow, you're talking about me. And then all of a sudden you can see like almost like they went back to when they were in fourth grade, you know, like the body position changes. They kind of think about that teacher that maybe said they were lazy or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And there is that guilt of like, you want the best for your child, but you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
And that's exactly why I do these interviews and I put out the content, because it's so important for us to have this conversation, because dyslexia really is like the number one learning difference or disability, however you want to classify that. And we have to, as educators, understand how to, you know, find these early indicators, how to understand it. Even if you don't know all the accommodations, you can at least say, hey, why don't we send you to the SLP to maybe get tested? Or why don't I send you to the special education department? And I don't know, maybe they can do some tests or something, rather than, well, this kid just, you know, he's lazy or doesn't want to do this or whatever it is, when it's, there's so much involved.
There is so much involved, and one of the things, you know, that you just mentioned. I mean, so imagine this: my mother when I'm in fourth grade, early '80s, feeling guilty that she didn't get my diagnosis earlier. Okay, and here I am, 40 years later, praising her for being so progressive, right?
Yes.
So we're in an evolution here as a movement, and the parents that are being proactive today will ultimately witness the payoff of their efforts. It may not be immediate, but it'll be generational. And that goes back to the other thing, is that, look, we're dyslexics in particular that don't get the support, the social emotional support that they need, let alone academically and reading.
Right.
They will engender that malignant self-esteem to the extent that it manifests in all these different ways. It's I'm going to attack before I get attacked. I'm not going to trust anybody. All these different manifestations. And so when you're talking about a parent who is undiagnosed, they finally find out that their child is diagnosed. They recognize that they have dyslexia, and then there's that myriad of acceptance, right? There's, first of all, the aha, okay, I'm not stupid. Then there's the, oh my gosh, I'm angry why I didn't get the support I needed. And then there is that creeping guilt that can come in, like, wow, I've been projecting my own sense of inadequacies onto my child. My child comes home and gets C's, and I say, well, you're not going to amount to anything, just like me, right? That could be one manifestation of it, right? Or another manifestation is, hey, I mean, it's just,
There's so much involved.
there's so much involved, and
Complex.
you could see how it goes. It continues generationally unless we cut it off at one point.
Absolutely. So I want to switch gears, and I would love if you could share about NoticeAbility. What's the mission? What does your organization do and provide?
Yeah, so we have nothing to do with reading, because there's a billion people that are focused on it, and thank God they are, because it's the critical first step. We're focused on that social emotional development of the child. We're interested, and by social emotional development, we're talking about how one regulates themselves in group environments, how they learn to negotiate, resolve conflict, certain executive functioning components, all this that we as adults understand we need to survive, right? But we don't introduce it necessarily for students, and we certainly don't introduce it for students with dyslexia unless you have the incredible opportunity to go to one of the private schools that you worked in.
Right.
What we focus on is creating a systemic solution. Maybe that's too bold a claim, but a systemic tool to add to the toolbox of educators who are focusing on the empowerment of students with dyslexia. There are a series of cognitive advantages that have been associated with the dyslexic mind. I don't have the time to go into it, nor do you, but it's extraordinary. It's all derived from a book called The Dyslexic Advantage. And when a person with dyslexia is exposed to these advantages, it's a genuine epiphany and recognition that there are inherent strengths that you assumed everybody else had, but they don't. And what the book also does is focuses on the professions where dyslexics are disproportionately successful. So we recognize that. as an opportunity to create courses for middle school students. And by that, I mean, we're speaking to an international audience and we work internationally, but approximately 11 to 14 years old.
Okay.
What we do is we distill the top 4 professions that we've identified: entrepreneurship, engineering, architecture, and the arts.
Okay. Yes.
We've distilled those into actual enrichment classes where we teach the fundamental tenets of those professions using online learning, the different modalities afforded in online learning like video, audio, graphic, pictorial.
Wow.
And then what we do is we have the teachers facilitate the project-based learning component that was taught in the online learning session. So if you're taking entrepreneurship, for example, you take 4 students, they're learning about identifying problems as opportunities in disguise and creating a unique solution and building a business plan for that idea.
Wow.
But they're working in groups. And by working in groups, they're inherently going to rub up against each other's sharp edges. Only then can they utilize the conflict resolution and the negotiation and the active listening that we've taught earlier in the class. So what we're trying to do is create a conduit to re-engage disenfranchised learners, meaning students with dyslexia, introduce them to the cognitive advantages associated with dyslexia in the context of those professions,
Right.
where they will inherently see those, and then allow them to work as teams and utilize those social emotional learning tools. The outcomes that we measure, and I promise to stop talking.
No, this is good. I'm trying to visualize all this in my head while you're saying this.
I'll give you the easiest summary in a second, but the outcomes that we're measuring are increases in self-esteem,
Right.
academic tenacity, and stigma consciousness.
Okay.
Have students grown more aware of the stigma they are placing on themselves or others are placing on them. The summary is we teach dyslexics what they're good at and they feel better about themselves.
I love that. So my question now is like, how does someone sign up for this? So if someone's listening to this and they're like, my kid needs this, where do they go? What do they do? Is this like an online module? And then there's a teacher that, I mean, talk about this. This is exciting.
So thank you for asking these questions. It's so great. So pre-COVID, what you would do is you would order a curriculum, one of those. It's actually, we've blended engineering and architecture into one. So you would purchase for a year access to one of our curriculum for a limitless number of students in your school. Usually public school, they'd offer it as an after-school club. Private school, usually in school.
Okay.
COVID struck. And we asked ourselves, could we be of service during this time? Because yes, kids were risking academic regression because schools were closed. But the way I saw it is dyslexics are, for the first time in their lives while they're at home, are not getting bombarded by a negative narrative.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point.
They're like, no school, sweet, right? Like, they're stoked, right? They don't get bullied. They don't get, So the point, what we tried to do is to see if we could replicate that in-classroom component in Zoom. And we got a bunch of international volunteers from Germany and Sweden and Zimbabwe, United States, Canada. Everybody came together and we posted this opportunity and got inundated by families who wanted to sign up. So we started to roll it out remotely, where I'm located on Eastern Standard Time, somebody else is in the UK, somebody else is in California, and somebody else is, and I would say, okay, you all do the online learning component. And then when we get into Zoom, I'm going to turn off my camera after a little bit of instruction and let you all speak to each other as you would. The key to our classes is giving the sense of autonomy to the students to work together, not me as the sage on the stage.
Yes.
You as ADHD, me as dyslexia, we're done with that. Like, we're cooked with that model, right? So what exactly glaze over. So the idea was we experimented with this, and we were like really quickly inundated by students from Australia and India, where we didn't even have representation. We couldn't handle those time zones. So we started training teachers or tutors in those geographical locations, sending
Right.
our students. So now we're in, I mean, now we're in 31 US states and 24 international countries.
Isn't that crazy how COVID did that though? Like I mean, there are a lot of negative things with COVID, but like I feel like people had to pivot. And I feel like businesses like yours, you're like, could we do this? Is this sustainable? And now look where you are a year and a half later.
Yes.
I mean,
It,
'cause this is a global issue. This is not just a United States issue with dyslexia. I mean, that is amazing.
well, it's been very encouraging to see what happens, quite frankly. I mean, the public and private educators watching this will say to themselves, love the idea of the program, but my higher ups either don't believe in dyslexia
Right,
or they don't
right,
want to say the D word. One of the things that's been very compelling is to go directly to families, because as a parent of a child with dyslexia, I can attest there's no more ravenous population in the world that is going to advocate for their child than the parent of the student with dyslexia. I mean, they
right,
are, we are bulldogs, like we don't stop. And to be able to go directly to us as a nonprofit organization and say, yes, I want this program and I don't want to have to go through my school because, by the way, it's closed, was an
right,
incredible opportunity for us to go directly to students. And one of the ancillary benefits was that we started to build this family type of feeling
right.
where kids were coming with a shared belief that they had, this disability, and we would watch the manifestation of them changing that into a perceived advantage. And now they're like hanging out. They're like, oh, hey, mom, what time is it in Cape Town? Because I want to talk with my buddy from class. They're like, mom's like, Cape Town? Like, why are you even bringing that up? Right? You're in sixth grade, like you haven't even done geography in Africa yet, right? But
That's
there's,
amazing.
it's really extraordinary.
So before we conclude this interview, where can people find you? Where can they sign up for this curriculum, this program?
Sure, we're going through a whole website overhaul, but if you go to noticeability.org, you may also hear when I say it, and this is deliberate, noticeability, no disability, right? If you
Oh no,
notice,
yeah. Yes. Yes.
right?
I just got that.
Right. So if you see my ability, you don't see my disability. If you notice my ability, you see no disability. So we've also got notice nodisability.org. Either way, you come to our website, and you can see how to get to our learning management platform, sign up for our classes, and we do also have our content in Dutch and Portuguese, and it's
Wow.
currently being translated into Mandarin, Cantonese, and Danish. So those last three will come later this year, I hope.
Excellent. Wow. Wow. Well, Dean, thank you so much for sharing your story and also sharing about noticeability. I've learned so much in this conversation, and I'm sure we'll be having more interviews.
Uh, I look forward to it, and I'm just so grateful for the work that you do, because awareness is everything. And then we can start to address these myriad needs of the students and families, quite frankly. So thank you for doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, we will connect another time. Have a good rest of your morning.
You too. Thanks so much.